Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Assessing Grid Health webinar. My name's Marcus Stewart, and I'm Head of Secretariat for the Green Grids Initiative, and we are hosting today's webinar. And we're looking forward to sharing the information from the three reports that have been done by SCAP, Sustainable Energy for All, and PSR, looking at grid health. So if you could just move the slides forwards, I'll do a brief introduction. Yes, that's me. Thank you. Right. So for today's webinar, I should give a quick introduction, and then I shall introduce you to Dan Hamza-Goodacre from the Pooled Fund for International Energy, who will explain a little bit more about the rationale behind the studies. And then we will launch into the three presentations across each region from Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. And then we will have time and quite a lot of time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please pop them in the chat as you go along, and we'll pick those up at the end. And also at the end, if you want to raise a question, please raise your hand, and we can hopefully get you to speak, and we can do a live Q&A. So we're really keen for this to be interactive and have questions. The authors are very keen to get feedback on the work, where what learnings are coming from that, what is of interest to you as your organisations, and where we should take the study and the work next. So very keen to get that feedback back and have a lively discussion. Just for information, we will be sharing the slides after the meeting. So there's no need to sort of take photos of the screen and stuff like that. We'll be sharing the material, so that will all be available at a later date, and we will be publishing the slides and material on various locations. I know we'll be able to put it on the Green Grids Initiative website, but also I think the authors will also be putting it on their websites as well. So you'll be able to get access to the material and also a recording of the webinar. Okay, so we can just move to the next slide, please. Right, so just a brief introduction from myself. So as I said, I head up the Green Grids Initiative, and I'm just going to explain a little bit about, if you don't know who we are and what we do. So the Green Grids Initiative, our role in life is to help accelerate the energy transition and deliver clean, help deliver and accelerate the grids to enable that transition to happen. And why are grids so important? Well, they are really the enabler or the blocker to the energy transition, and certainly to full electrification and clean electricity. There's around 3,000 gigawatts of clean energy projects in connection queues at the moment. There is around, it takes around 10 years or more to build new grid infrastructure. We need to double the investment in grids on an annual basis between now and 2030, and build around 80 million kilometers in that time. So there's a huge amount of work to be done on the grids, and if we aren't moving it fast enough, then we are not going to be able to deliver on the ambitions to triple the amount of renewable generation globally. So it's absolutely fundamental, and there's some systemic challenges around delivering the grid infrastructure as well. So being able to finance it, being able to build it in terms of planning, permitting, and operation, and also challenges around delivering it through supply chain and skills. So there's lots of work to be done, and that's one of the areas that we focus on. The way we do it, next slide please, is we bring together a global network of engaged and coordinated organizations that really help focus on some of these key challenges. So we operate at the moment in Asia Pacific and in Africa, although we've done some convening and some training work in Latin America as well. And what we do is we focus on three key areas really. So the funding and financing of grids. So what are some of the systemic challenges around that, and how can we bring people together to solve that? So one of the things we've done there is develop a set of climate finance principles, which will enable grids to be better attract concessional finance, because currently only around about 40% of grids projects in economies in transition will be eligible for clean finance. So we're working with the finance industry to remedy that situation and make grids more applicable to climate finance, but by changing the rules and looking at the general long-term benefit that grids provide. So that's a key piece of work that we're doing there. We also focus on planning and operation and really linking countries and organizations that are at the cutting edge of delivering the energy transition, what they're learning, and being able to share that through codifying some of those activities, building databases of best practice, turning that into training tools, and sharing that knowledge. So absolutely key. So we can't deliver the energy transition with just one country or one jurisdiction, getting a clean grid. All need to move forward. So we need to help each other, and that's one of the areas that we're focusing on. And then the third area that we focus on is around supply chain. Particularly in transmission, there is a limited amount of capacity, especially with tier one manufacturing. So how can we help accelerate that? So we hold dialogues between governments and supply chains to really look at how we can free up the pipeline, look at standardization and other ways to bring on more supply chain capacity to deliver on the ambitions to double up the grid infrastructure really. So that's what we do. We're really keen on sharing knowledge and connecting organizations, and we have an ecosystem of around 150 organizations that we work with. It's growing all the time, and if you're interested in connecting with us and finding out about more what we do, and also joining some of our work groups focusing on some of those areas, please don't hesitate to connect with us. So as part of that sharing, we're very keen to host this webinar today and to share this important piece of work that has been commissioned by the Pooled Fund for International Energy to really support the Storage and Grids Pledge that was committed to at the last COP in Azerbaijan. So I'm now going to hand over to Dan Hansa-Goodacre from PI to talk a little bit about why they commissioned this study and the importance of the work. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Marcus. Quick sound check. You can hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. Thank you firstly to GGI for hosting the webinar today, and to everybody who has dialed in. A quick bit of background from me, and then I just wanted to make 3 points. So in terms of background, as Marcus said, I work for the Pooled Fund on International Energy. It's part of a wider field of climate philanthropy, and our particular focus is on clean energy globally, especially in emerging markets and developing economies. As with many other stakeholders in the clean energy space, we have realized that grids are a bottleneck, as Marcus just set out there with his initial slides about some of the challenges in terms of timelines for permitting and curtailment of renewables and so forth. That bottleneck challenge has led us to start creating a global philanthropic collaboration to provide grant support to a range of civil society and other organisations to solve grids challenges, particularly with a focus on the global south. And this philanthropic collaborative will be publicly launched later on this year, so watch this space for further details. In terms of the 3 points I wanted to make, the first is around the need for baseline data on grids in order to understand where we are today, but in particular what the problems are and what the gaps are in order to inform solutions, and also to monitor progress. And that's progress yes, in relation to the global grids and storage pledge that was made at COP last year, but it's also progress at the national level, and probably that's even more important than how all of this aggregates up at the global level. So by creating these baselines and understanding, as per the title of today's webinar, what is the health of different grids around the world, and how does that inform policy development? How does that inform financial solutions and investment? How does that form development and build? How does that inform the operation of grids? So these reports are a really good start, and congratulations to the 3 organisations that have been involved in making this happen, covering the Asia Pac region, covering Africa, and covering Latin America. Not able to do every single country in the world, that would be quite a tall order, but there's a very good range of case studies here, around 40 countries that have been studied. So I really encourage some feedback and some thinking around who needs the data, and that's part of what we realized in the study, was like, who actually needs this data and what do they need the data for? So I think that would be great in terms of comments and reflections from those that are on the call today. We know some of this data is needed for system operators. We know some of it's needed for grid regulators and policymakers. We know some of it's needed for financial institutions. So who needs it and what is the data needed for? And then we know that we're going to need to revisit this data on a regular basis in order to track progress and continue to inform what actually needs to happen and how we direct essential finance that's needed. That's the first point. The second point is to think a little bit more broadly, again, for feedback today. What can grid data not help us with, right? So it's definitely going to help us solve some of these challenges about grids and then clean energy more generally, but it won't actually help with everything. So we need to be really aware of the data limitations. And to give you an example, I mean, for all of the sort of knowledge around how grids are being planned and deployed and operated, they're not going to solve the challenges of very high interest rates in some developing countries, for example. So what does data help us with? What does data not help us with? Where will we need to do further work elsewhere? That's the second point. And it's also a question to everybody. And then the third and final point is, what can we infer from data in one country about another country? And we had quite a lot of debates between the various teams doing these reports about to the extent to which we should compare data. And it's quite challenging to do that because it needs to be standardized. And also it starts to run the risk that one country feels potentially that they've been underscored versus another one. So we certainly strayed away from scoring, but at the same time, you can definitely infer from what's happening in one country whether another country is missing an opportunity, whether there is scope for further action, because you can see it somewhere else in a very comparable way. And a lot of this data is quite comparable. So definitely encourage everybody to think about what we can infer from this data about where we can do better. So that's it for me. Just a final thanks again to SCAP, to PSR and to SE4All for their great work. And I very much look forward to the discussion today. Marcus, back to you. Marcus, is he still with us? Technology problems? Mar, do you know if Marcus is still here?
I was going to say that probably he has some tech issues.
I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, he's there.
No problem.
Yeah, apologies. Yeah, thank you, Dan, for that introduction. That's great. Yeah, so as Dan said, we're really interested in your views and trying to understand how we can utilize this learning and take this work forward. I'm now going to launch into our presentation. So our first presentation is from Kieran Clark, who's the energy connectivity expert within the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So Kieran, over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Marcus. Could we pull up my slides? Perfect, thank you. We can go to the next slide, Mar. So I think Dan provided really useful kind of context, overarching kind of vision for this work. So we can dive kind of straight into the kind of methodological questions. So obviously, as Dan has kind of very articulately set out, the point of this work is to provide a baseline, to provide a kind of in-time snapshot of where grids are, for us, focusing on Asia and the Pacific. But equally important for us, since this is kind of a new initiative, something that we're starting kind of from scratch, was to kind of pilot a methodology or kind of a conceptual framework that acts as kind of a proof of concept for this type of work. So sets out a kind of methodology for how this work, well, hopefully provides a starting point for this work and how it can then be developed, including kind of testing the quality of open source data on grids that is currently available. So as well as doing the analysis and doing the data collection, that was a critically important part of this work. So we started off with a very long list of indicators, more than 50 indicators, and we did data collection around that. But so based on that initial analysis and based on that initial data collection, the list was kind of synthesized into a focused set of key indicators, right, which I'll present in a moment. So those key indicators were designed to represent the kind of most critical considerations for the assessment of grid readiness. In our perspective, as Dan said, we're really looking forward to feedback on this work, on all the aspects of this work. So in our perspective, what are those most critical considerations for grid readiness? And in our case, this was obviously tailored to some extent to the Asia Pacific context, right? We work very closely with SE4 on this, but the Africa indicators were slightly different to the Asia Pacific ones, just because regional differences matter. And what we're trying to do in kind of keeping with this idea of piloting a conceptual framework is to make sure that the methodology that we came up with was scalable, was adjustable, and was replicable. Right. So that was something that we kept in mind as we went through the methodology. So in our case, we looked at 11 countries from the Asia Pacific region, from developed countries like Australia, Singapore, Korea, Japan, to less developed countries in Southeast Asia and Central Asia. You have the list there. I won't read them out. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So these are the key indicators. You'll see there's kind of 5 buckets: grid power sector transition, so broad vision for how the power sector transition is going, grid development, grid operation, consumer and demand side, and distribution. So you'll see in the report, we have a very large table where we have all of this data against these key indicators for each of the countries, but then we break it out per country as well, with some commentary on grid development activities in each of those countries. Next slide, please. So in terms of kind of key findings or kind of themes, the first thing I wanted to say is, if you're from a country that is struggling or has issues with grid development, you're not alone. So basically all countries that we surveyed faced issues of one kind or another with developing national grids. A lot of the time, sometimes this was kind of context specific, and there were obviously context specific questions or issues in each of the countries. But a lot of the time, actually, they were very, very consistent across countries in terms of the issues that were faced, especially across countries with similar levels of development. So, for example, developing countries, I mentioned some of the ones that we surveyed on the previous slide, they tended to encounter kind of technical and procedural challenges, while developing countries, much of Southeast Asia, etc., tended to face issues related to finance and kind of project development. So I think what was also key is in developed countries, which tended to have slightly higher rates of VRE penetration, they were facing serious issues in kind of making the grid fit for purpose for kind of high VRE future. I mean, Australia, which is where I'm from, is a kind of classic example of that. Whereas developing countries tend to face just basic challenges of sufficiently developing grids for power system reliability and resilience. Dan mentioned it before, but project approval is a critically important issue that was faced basically across the board. And another thing that is pretty much universal is finance. So even in developed countries, financing grid infrastructure remains a massive challenge. And I think that is also kind of a reflection of the policy challenge as well. So getting policy frameworks right in order to get that finance flowing. Next slide, please. I'll deal with the data question on this slide. So again, as I said, this is kind of designed to be a proof of concept. I think we took away some kind of key learnings that we can take forward with this work as we continue to develop it. So yeah, it is possible to develop a simple framework for assessing grid readiness that can be broadly applied. So as I mentioned at the start, this was very much co-developed with SE4. So a very similar framework or methodology was used for Asia and Africa, with similar results and similar applicability. So I think it's useful in that sense. Again, something that Dan mentioned, I think we feel quite strongly that it's problematic to compare countries using the same metrics and indicators. So countries coming from very, very different socioeconomic contexts, economic and energy policy related starting points. And so comparing them with the simple framework that we've come up with is slightly problematic. So we've tried not to do that. And instead, what I guess the point here is to provide, as Dan also mentioned, a baseline for understanding each country's strengths, weaknesses, where they're at, etc., that can then be tracked over time. I wanted to mention the data question. So I think what we took away from this is that there's a wealth of publicly available open source data on grids. The significant majority of the data that we looked for, that we sought, was found, which is great, very, very positive, and I think allowed us to be able to paint a quite rich picture. But the kind of proviso with that is that significant data gaps still exist, and the point I would like to make here is that often the most important data for assessing grids and the health of grids were those that were missing. So that's something that really needs to be looked into. Yeah, so I think another point is that while in our reports we provide kind of a high level overview, this is a kind of macro view, right? What we really need to do is to drill down into country contexts with more detailed policy and technical analysis to properly assess grid readiness. And then the last point similarly that I'd like to make in terms of lessons is that we did 11 countries to really, really glean the type of kind of key learnings that I mentioned in the previous slide. We need to do a broader cross section. So that's again another area where work can be expanded on or taken forward. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I guess I've kind of tried to mention some of the kind of applications along the way. So yes, this provides a baseline for tracking. Hopefully it's a useful input to energy planning, to thinking about what investments are required and what technical assistance is required. But really, I think this should inform future assessments, both in terms of getting more comprehensive country assessment, so doing more countries, and also drilling down into the data a little bit more. So that will probably require going outside of open source data into primary sources within ministries, doing consultation with countries, etc. But here, in terms of application and next steps, this is really where we wanted feedback from the group. Please let us know how you think it can be improved, how you think it can be taken forward. Yeah, we're very much looking forward to the discussion. I would just like to say in closing that this was very much a collaborative exercise with PSR, but also very closely with SE4. So great thanks to SE4 for the excellent collaboration on this. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Kieran. I know we're going to do Q&A at the end, but there was a quick question that came in from Rena around, can you explain what the missing indicators were? If you could quickly answer that one, Kieran, that might be helpful now.
So I think that's something we can take offline, Rena, but we had a lot. So we started off with 50 and we probably halved. So to name all the ones that we didn't go with would take a little bit of time, but I'm happy to discuss. Happy to kind of share the initial list if that's of interest.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Kieran. Right. Okay, so that's presentation one. Thank you very much. And now we're over to Brian, SE for All. Brian is the Director for Energy Transition and has been leading this study for Africa. So Brian, over to you. I think you're sharing your screen, aren't you? Yeah, I see it coming up now. Brilliant. Over to you, Brian.
Good to unmute myself. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Brian Dean. At SE for All, of course, we're very focused on achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 7. And fundamental to that is achieving many of the pledges that have been committed between COP28 and COP29. And so we are in this game to make sure that we really have data-driven information so that we can have better decision-making to achieve COP29 Global Energy Storage and Grids Pledge, which enables the ability to achieve the tripling and doubling of efficiency, which helps achieve the Paris Agreement, which helps achieve SDG 7. So all of these things are connected, and we find this to be a really fundamental work, the foundation, you can say, of the energy transition. So while the data for every country, as Kieran mentioned, is different and the availability is different, we did look at common opportunities across the 10 countries that we looked at. And of course, there's different scales of development in Africa as well, with Egypt having the highest electricity access, the highest energy consumption per capita, the more sophisticated systems. Really only 2 countries, though, have average energy consumption per capita that is achieving the modern energy minimum of 1,000 kWh per person. So the story in Africa is very different than the story in Asia, as Kieran was noting. But a lot of the overall trends are quite interesting. And in particular, I've got 4 on this particular slide. First is maximizing flexibility. Now, while many countries in Africa are not stressing the grids, meaning the grids are not overburdened with renewables, they're not overburdened with people using much energy. And so in that scenario, there's an opportunity for growth of the grids to, number one, deliver more energy to the people that need it, the consumer services themselves, and to support a future which has much more renewable energy on it, possibly bidirectional energy, and of course, variable intermittent energy sources. So maximizing flexibility is a specific issue that we found common across the African countries. 2, on grid development, we've seen that there's limited development corridors for renewables, and mainly seen in Nigeria and South Africa, which are two of the more advanced countries in the 10 that we've examined. However, sort of really across the board, there were opportunities for improving how energy is priced, for the the energy planning that goes behind the grid development, and the sort of the institutional capacity to be able to approve and drive grid development, which is of course a really important fundamental for Africa, given the energy access and rural communities that don't have grid-connected energy. The grid operations side, now this is how the energy is actually getting out, so not the grid development itself, but the actual operations of the grids. There are really strong opportunities for having more real-time digital services, and improving the codes to be able to drive investments in the digital infrastructure. So while growth of these grids needs to happen to increase energy access and also drive the energy transition, if the code design and grid infrastructure is able to be improved to be digital, that would help a ton in enabling that flexibility of the grid. And then the final sort of common opportunity that we saw was the benefit of having power trade and via interconnectors, and recognizing that between the transmission and the distribution, there's an opportunity for grid efficiency gains. There's a lot of grid losses in some of these countries, and so there's an opportunity for reducing both the technical and commercial losses in the transmission and the distribution systems in particular. So with that, sort of stepping back into the indicator and data side, we also looked at 5 categories. These are quite similar to what Kieran showed, with the difference being that we have the distribution indicators inside of the grid development and grid operations, and then we have a 5th category on sustainability and just transition. And what you'll see from this is that in the 10 pilot countries that we looked at, the data availability is really quite good in terms of policy, market structure, understanding the sustainability of the grids. Many countries are actually fairly low carbon in Africa, in comparison to other countries around the world. And but the big gap, so in terms of Rena's question in the chat, the big areas within the key indicators, because there's the broader overall set of indicators, and then there's the key indicators. Within the key indicators, the biggest gaps were in the grid operations and grid development ecosystems. So as Karen noted, those are 2 of the most fundamentals for understanding the grids. So some of the most fundamental ones are not well understood in every country. So 71% and 65% of those indicators were available in the 10 countries that we looked at. I'll also say that this pilot study, we collected data from every country globally. And then it was for these 10 countries, we did a deeper dive on data. So we have, we have a database that has global data and deeper data in the countries that we worked in. We were also able to get feedback from one country. Not every country was able to keep up with our project timeline, and so we haven't been able to get additional feedback from countries. But I think that's one of the next steps that needs to happen for every country around the world, is to look at their data in a collected way, and to be able to support better data-driven understanding of the grids in their countries. So with that, both Dan and Kieran mentioned that we don't want to compare countries. And so what you'll see on this slide are dots that represent countries, but no distinguishing characteristics that would let anybody know which countries those are. And about the first half of our project, we were working very closely with SCAP to wrestle through the methodology. We had a sort of a 5x5 matrix. The 5 categories from the policy market structure, development operations, consumer services, and sustainability. And then looking at what the prioritization is of actions that are needed to drive progress. And doing this through an index score basis. And it was that process that was a recognition that if we don't have really good data, then the index score is not going to be as accurate as possible. And then therefore, it's really difficult to compare countries. However, I'm showing this slide because I find the visual quite interesting to show that which categories maybe need more attention. And so what you'll see is that most countries have reasonable plans and approaches towards sustainability, but it is in Africa, it's the grid services to consumers that is struggling the most. It's the policy and market structure and the grid operations. Those are the ones that need the most attention in Africa. And so this is an interesting area to reflect on what the data can say in an anonymized way, recognizing that it's really important to step into countries, work with a country and look at all the data of that country to understand where the gaps are in the country. Now, that then led to a step in this process where we looked at, well, what is happening globally? And this is why we had to pull data globally. And now we have some not availables here because if there are some data sets not available for every category globally. But when you're looking at a single country and then comparing that to a global high and low, and theoretically you should also have a global 75th percentile and 25th percentile or something like that, so you understand sort of where they are in the spectrum. But what you'll see here is that across these 5 different categories, there's some very useful key indicators, and the spread for them is dramatic. If you just look at the SAFI and SAIDI, which is the frequency of interruptions and the duration of interruptions, you'll see that some countries globally basically have no interruptions in their energy supplies, whereas some have a frequency of 80 interruptions and a duration of 243 minutes of interruptions. And so, very dramatically different grid situations in those countries. Transmission and grid losses, the 86.4% that happens to be Palestine, Gaza, but there are many other countries that are in the 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% range as well. So being able to look at each of these data points in that context is very helpful. So this is why we're pulling together an online version of the full database, so that and the sourcing for all that data, so you can go back to the primary source. Happy to work with other partners to make sure that this is useful for your own work and your partners as well. Based on that, the key message from our side is that healthy electricity grids are critical for achieving sustainable energy for all. That's what it means for us. And that as energy systems evolve, strong grids and mini grids. So I think there was maybe a question in the chat about rural communities. Mini grids are going to be really fundamental for looking at essentially the cost to deliver reliable electricity, decarbonized electricity to communities around the world. In many cases, the grid extensions will drive that decarbonization and electricity access. But in some cases, particularly remote island communities and very remote communities, mini grids are the fundamental solution for driving this and supporting economic growth of those communities and better livelihoods. So future-ready grids and mini-grids must be adaptable, shock-resistant to all the climate impacts that are happening these days, and of course capable of integrating renewables that may be variable and intermittent and bidirectional. So with that, I will hand it back over to Marcus.
Thank you, Brian. Really great insights there, I think, and I particularly like the suggestion of having the different percentiles to see where your country fits in comparison to others. The high and low was useful, but I do think maybe showing those percentiles would be really good as well, because as you said, there was some clear outliers there. So next up. Yeah. I'm hoping, because I know she's been having some connection issues, Amanda Fernandez from PSR will be covering the Latin America study. Amanda, are you there? Do we have Amanda?
She was here a few minutes ago. Can't see her anymore though.
Oh.
She's there and her mic is on.
Oh, yeah. She said I'm here.
Yeah. We can't hear you, Amanda.
I wonder if Julia is able to speak.
So that's strange. Right. Well, I think while we wait for Amanda to try and connect, yeah, Brian, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So to keep us going. When you talked about data availability and you said grid operations was, I guess the missing where's most missing data. I just wondered whether there was any correlation between countries where there's I guess more of a market and others which are more vertically integrated, and whether you could say that with vertically integrated it's more difficult to get the information or not. Did you see any sort of correlations like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, the countries that have more advanced electricity markets were easier to find data from. So I think both Egypt and Nigeria being sort of two of the more advanced ones in Africa were a little bit easier to have a full set of data. Yeah. However, I mean, there were just some data types. I mean, if you look at the overall database, you can see that there are some indicators that just have. It's either that the data is locked in national documents that may not be public, such as transmission loss. As opposed, in terms of the distribution losses specifically. Transmission losses were a little bit easier to find, yeah, I'm not sure exactly which other ones, but we had to do some very detailed analysis to get additional information for the 10 pilot countries that is not available just generically, and so you had to go into many of the national documents for transmission losses and reliability and flexibility indicators in particular. I don't know, Kieran, if you had a similar situation.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think while noting that most of the countries surveyed and most of the countries in Asia have vertically integrated systems, I think it's more of a question of developed versus developing countries, a bit like I mentioned in my slides. So developed countries tend to have more market-based power systems, whereas developing countries more vertically integrated. But those developed countries tend to have much better data, right? But I don't think that's a function of system configuration, more just the data availability across levels of development.
Okay, thanks both. I'm just checking to see whether Amanda's managed to connect again. Are you there, Amanda?
In the meantime, Marcus, I read Rena's question, and I realized I didn't probably fully answer it. So, Rena,
Okay.
Some of the kind of key things that we really struggled to find data around, some of the key, like the absolutely critical things that we really struggled with was, so curtailment rates, that was very difficult to find. Connection queues for renewables projects, that was really hard to find. Average project timelines was difficult, and project costs. So these are all absolutely critical for the assessments that we're trying to do, but we found it really hard to find in terms of open source data. So again, calling on the crowd, if people do have access to that data, please do let us know. I know the IEA has a global figure for connection queues, so happy to exchange on that, but just wanted to come over the top and provide a little bit more detail there. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran. And just to reiterate, actually, the availability of open source data is absolutely critical. I know in the UK we had an energy data task force that was specifically to focus on making all sorts of energy data available. And the conclusion that they came from was that we should by default, the data should be transparent and available, and under only extreme circumstances should it be withheld if it's for sort of critical national infrastructure or security reasons or something like that. But the default position should be to share that data. And I know that was bringing together the whole of the industry, from the grid operators, distribution owners, and market participants to feed into that kind of work. So again, that requirement, I think better data makes better decisions, doesn't it, really? And the first step is getting availability to it, and then you can see when you start to understand the data, what good data looks like as well. I see poor Amanda is still struggling to come
I don't
online.
know, everyone, if you can hear me. Is Julia here?
Hi, Julia.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So I can take over if you like. I don't know if I know what's happening, but we can keep going.
Okay. Does that? Okay, that's brilliant, Julia, for you taking over. If you, I think you will have to present the slides then, I assume, unless you've got the slides there, Julia.
So you have the slides there, or okay?
I think Mar should have a copy of the slides.
Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll switch over to the slides. But Julia, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. I'm Julia. I work here in PSR with Amanda in the grid and network studies, and about, I don't know, 4 years now, and it'd be a pleasure here to present it. And I have done this work with her for some, I don't know, 4 or 5 months. It was a very nice work, and with very good people to work with. So I have nice results to show you. And I don't know if Mar, if you have the.
Yes,
slides,
give me
okay.
one tiny second because I have to switch between
No
the
worries,
ones
no
that are
worries.
there.
Because I don't know if I share, I'm afraid that I will lose everything. Because
yeah, no, now we've got you, we don't want to lose you.
yeah, I couldn't share the camera, I couldn't open the mic, I can't open Q&A, for example, so I'm a little afraid of what I can and cannot do with Teams here.
Okay, we go. Okay.
Okay, give me 1 second. They're on my other screen now.
Okay.
So here in PSR, we are a worldwide company. We study a lot of countries, but in this work specifically, we studied the indicators for Latin America. You can move on, please, Mark. And for the Latin American countries, we studied 12 of those countries. We studied Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, where we are here in PSR, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. And we studied majorly 5 groups of 5 dimensions. There are renewables, the quality and accessibility, the reliability, flexibility, and some strategic aspects of the grids. So we planned to understand how those countries developed their grids in these major dimensions. You can please move forward. So these indicators that we studied, when we talk about renewables, we are talking about the renewable participation in power generation, and then we are talking about the intermittent renewables and the normal, when we are counting hydropower as well. We are talking about installed capacity. We are talking about CO2 emissions in the generation. We are talking about decarbonization targets. And when we think about quality and accessibility, we think about losses and electrification rates, electricity intensity, growth rates of line extension, and growth rate of demand. And this, we think that it's an interesting data and an interesting indicator, because it can show us if the grid is growing as rapid and as fast as it should be to accommodate all the demand that is growing too, or if it's expanding more or less, because sometimes we have more grid than we have demand, or sometimes we have more demand than we have grid. And this indicates how we should continue to grow. Also the efficacy, oh no, sorry, not yet. The efficacy of the generator, the generator access process. We studied, as of other friends here, the SID and SIFI, some of the more common indicators. Lowered supply and total consumption. This is interesting because here in Brazil, majorly we have many exchanges and cross borders with other countries, and also in Argentina, also in other countries here in South America. We are studying building a big grid in all of South and Latin America, connecting everything, just like it's in Europe, for instance. The flexibility, we studied curtailment, because here in some countries, and as Brazil and as in Chile, we have many solar power. So we have a ramp that is really important, and it can be a problem in some times of the day. So it's an important to understand how these countries deal with this ramp, with the net demand ramp. And also we study some demand response programs, but they're not very, very expressive here. You can please go on. So some examples that we think that are important and some results that are interesting is the renewable participation in power generation in Chile is, for example, very impressive. They are 35%, they have 35% of its matrix of renewables. So it's quite impressive when we're thinking about some Latin American countries. The cross-border electricity exchanges as well. When we think about Argentina, they have they export and they have export and imports generations to Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile as well. Many gigawatts in the last years, in the past year, sorry. And like I said, then, and we think that that's an important result and an important information is the hourly net demand ramp, that here in Brazil, we can see that when the solar is entering, so from 12 to 1 p.m. and to 2 p.m., more or less, when we have more generation from solar, and also earlier, but when we have really big generation from solar, we can see that this is, we have also the demand going down. So we have this ramp for 36 gigawatts here that can be seen, and that we can, when this generation starts to go down from 6 p.m., that the solar generation, it's no longer there. We are not counting with this generation, so we kind of lose this, and we have to have this generation from another kind of source. So we have to have the flexibility to use the system. So this is an important thing to accommodate with the grid. So I think that this is an important result as well. And also this is an important result for other countries. So the demand ramp is an important thing, that when we lose solar, when we are entering and losing solar, in those two aspects. The next slide, please. Mark, can you?
It's already on the next slide. Key findings?
No? Oh, no, for me, it's in the same.
Yeah, it hasn't moved on, Mark. Hasn't moved on yet, Mark.
No, it's there. It's still on examples.
Oh, it is for me. I don't know. Let me take it back and then. Nothing?
No.
Hmm.
Okay. Right, technical problems still happening there.
Yeah.
Maybe Julia, if you could cover the key findings, and hopefully the slide will catch up shortly.
Okay. So for our key findings, I think that we have some limited data as well as some other countries that we have heard here with our colleagues. Because one of the open access is not available for everything, and also it's not regularly updated, some of the data. So we have this limitation. But however, the renewable participation here in Latin America, it's quite impressive, very across the regions, and it tends to grow. So here we are seeing that solar, and mostly solar, it's growing really fast. Some countries like Uruguay, for example, the wind, it's growing really fast, but in general, we can see that renewables is growing, and like we are seeing still in this graphic here in the net demand ramp, that is important to have flexibility to accommodate this this variation of renewables. So as we see these renewables entering, we need to have this flexibility as well of the grids. As a long-term vision, we see that the planning is essential to ensure our grid infrastructure and to also to make it possible to decarbonize the matrix, and also to make it possible to get the net zero targets that we are aiming. And we, as country and as I think that as a whole planet, that we are trying to get there. So all countries here are making their effort. And for the few next steps, I think that this study aims to define some methodologies here to overall the health of grids, and finding some support to make the strategic decisions, and highlight some needs to understand and make some politics, and to have some attention in infrastructure necessities, and make some, I don't know, make some plannings, more specific plannings, make some future efforts to improve data transparency, and also make it more consistent reporting, or making more, making more, how do you say it? Frequently, make it more frequent, the data, and I think that's what we thought about, saying the steps and the message. And this is an initial assessment, I think, that for the power grids and all the regions and indicators. We think that we have good data here overall in Latin America, and we are growing fast. And to keep this growth, we need to be very diligent and very, we need to build very strong grids, and also flexible grids that can absorb this green power, and make this net zero a real thing. I think that's it. That's the message here.
Hi everyone, can you hear me now?
Yes. Is that Amanda?
Yes, it's Amanda.
Oh.
So thank you so much, Julia, for presenting. Julia was my right hand during this work. So I'm glad that she did, and she did very well. I just, because in behalf of time, because I think we have only more 20 minutes, I just would like to add something that regarding what Dan has asked about what can we refer from one country to another one. I mean, that was a topic of discussion that we had in our previous meeting. And I think that one of the key things here, it's not only about comparing the countries, because we don't have all the data, the countries are very different. But it's once it's there, it's all the data there, maybe the countries can learn from each other. So for example, if I'm worried in a certain region about losses, when I look at the data, I see that Panama has reduced the losses over the past years. So I would like, if I'm investor, if I'm policymaker, would like to understand what Panama is doing and what's applicable to me. And the same, for example, regarding the renewable penetration. When I look at the data, Chile is one of the countries that in the past 5 years have been increasing the penetration of variable renewable energy. So I would like to know what they are doing and what are the key learnings. And as for the fact that about the curtailment that Julia had commented, that we have seen some countries. So if I'm in a region that I'm expanding these renewables, I would like to understand why the other countries that already have, they are facing the curtailment. So what they have done and what can I learn from that? So I think that's one of the key aspects from this project in the end, is when you provide all the data, all the informations, it's the idea of one country can be able to learn from one to see what they have been doing. So I just would like to add that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think, that's a really great point to end on in terms of, one of the hopes that we have from this work is it will make, people think about, if my system looks like this and I see another country that has got, maybe further down the curve in terms of integration renewables, or has reduced losses, or have faster planning timeframes, what are they doing differently to me that I can learn? And I think that's, and in order to do that, you've got to understand, what's happening. So this is a really, I think this is a really good step to, start bringing out that data and making it visible so that organizations and countries can, I guess, see where they fit against others, and also definitely, know where to look to learn. And one of the things that we do within GGI through one of our programs, the Electricity Transition Playbook, is we bring countries together and do peer-to-peer learning on that, because that's much more valuable than north to south learning sometimes, in terms of being able to say, if I'm in a situation that's similar to my neighbor, what is my neighbor doing well in that same situation that I can learn from. So great points. We're now into the Q&A section of the webinar. So I think there's a few questions that have come through in the chat, and I'm reluctant to say, if you want to speak, put your hand up and speak, because I'm not sure whether we can try that, but please put questions in the chat, and we'll address those to all the panelists. So I think there was, I think I saw a question around whether nuances or differences between transmission and distribution data. That was one of the early questions, I think. I'm just going through my list of questions that I picked up. So I'll put that to the panelists first off. I don't know who would like to go first. If we could go in the order the presentations went, if that works easier. So Kieran, do you want to go first, and then Brian, and then Vanessa?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. So I would agree with the premise of the question that the challenges are quite different in transmission versus distribution. We focused almost entirely on transmission, and we did a little bit of digging on distribution towards the end of the process. The only point, the kind of key point that I would make, is that it was much, much, much harder to find data on distribution than it was on transmission. And there's obvious reasons for that, but I think definitely as a kind of next step, if we're thinking about next steps, and happy to kind of expand on my views on next steps as well, in addition to what I presented in the presentation. Distribution, a focus on distribution would be, I think, extremely useful. Trying to do a kind of a deep dive into distribution. Yeah, thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, Brian.
And when we were looking at this section of data in the overall database, we've got transmission data, we've got distribution data, and we've got mini-grid data. And transmission data definitely has the highest frequency of available data and quality. Distribution, you know, as Kieran said, we kind of got into the distribution grid information towards the middle to end of the project and added quite a bit in, but it's definitely not as available as the transmission side. But we got good data, and then on the mini grid side, of course, that's only for countries that are you know, planning to deliver mini grids, and so we've got information on the capacity of existing mini grids and planned mini grids. But again, the number of countries that have this data is very limited. So yeah, over to Julia or Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's pretty much the same here in Latin America. Transmission data, it's more robust than distribution overall. We do have in some countries, it's easier to have distribution data, but overall transmission is really easier. It's more everywhere we can find it. I think it's just because it's a country interested, the whole country is interested in, so it's a whole country effort to have it, and so it's easier to have it. That's it.
Thank you all. I mean, you know, I think this, just looking at the questions or some of the points, not necessarily questions, but data availability seems to be, you know, on forefront on people's mind, and you know, how do you get access to it? I think there's one question here that suggests that, you know, if data availability for critical indicators is an issue, and availability of data overall seems to correlate to levels of development, what do you take away from that in terms of need for alternative methods for prioritizing areas of intervention? That's quite a, so I think, you know, what can we learn? So, you know, in terms of interventions needed, then I guess is the question there. So again, should we do that in order? And Dan, and I'll let you come in as well afterwards.
Sure, I can take a stab at that, but Dan, do you want to come in at this point?
No, thanks, Kieran. I've got a separate question, so go on, answer that one first, and then I'll come in after. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. I think the whole point of this exercise is to kind of have the data in front of us in order for those interventions to be defined, right? So if you're talking about defining interventions when the data is missing, it becomes quite hard to define those interventions. For me, I think the obvious next step would be to, and this kind of gets to Rena's question as well, which is in the chat. The obvious next step for me would be to actually go to countries and sit with the utilities, sit with the ministries, etc., and see what data they can actually share. So like actually mining some of that primary data that is not available in open source sources, to kind of build that data coverage. But in terms of interventions, to Anna's question, I think one thing that would be really useful, I think, is a lot of the time this data is just not well collected or well stored in countries. So to actually go to countries and sit with utilities, sit with system operators, etc., and kind of say, oh, this is how you might be able to collect the data better. This is how you might be able to store the data better. If you're actually thinking about kind of as a development partner, the types of interventions that you could do specifically on the data side, that seems to be an obvious one for me.
Thanks, Kieran.
Yeah,
Brian or Julia, would you? Yes, go for it, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I I put an interesting response a little bit in the chat that gets into this, but recognizing that there's a spectrum of data availability, there's also a spectrum of data quality. And yeah, as Karen mentioned, it's about going in country and seeing what's really needed and looking at not just the data that they have, but trying to even use new data techniques, data mining techniques, or data modeling techniques to better understand the situation in country. So there's reported data, and sometimes that reported data is based on actual surveys and audits and actual correct data. And in some cases, you could use other techniques to really understand the situation. Anyway, the overall, I think, point of the question is, you need certain data quality to understand the opportunities, and some modeling techniques can be used to understand it as well, not necessarily just relying on primary data. You can use secondary data techniques as well. Julia?
Yeah, I think I agree that you can use the secondary data, but also I would suggest that maybe continuing, as Karen said, that you should talk with the TSO, maybe constructing something, I don't know, aggregator or some kind of entity that could, I don't know, aggregate all data or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of database or something like it that could keep it going on and everything, and also offering some training and treatment of this data, and also other secondary treatment. And I don't know, Amanda, if you want to add.
No, I think it's perfect. I think it's aligned with what everyone has said. And what we have seen is that it's not that the data is not available, because the country, the operator, he has the information. He just sometimes doesn't have the culture of sharing, of updating, of making public. And I think it's always an ongoing process and something that has to be improved and better over the years. So I think that one of the keys will be scaling up the data practice, having this culture more strong on the countries. And I think that's why one of the indicators we have is the data availability. So we have described what's the data availability of this country and what are the gaps. So maybe one of the things would be increasing this culture of sharing the data, because we have the information when we are operating the system. We just have to learn and how to make it public and updated for all the policymakers and people interested, because we have to make data-driven analysis, right?
Great, thank you. I mean, yeah, it sounds really interesting here in terms of almost a call for a set of global standards for recording and capturing this data, and and finding a way of sharing it, so which could be a possible direction to take. But I'm going to let Dan come in now. I think you've got your hand up, and I'm just going to say I don't think viewers of the webinar are able to speak. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, because I don't think you've got the ability to speak other than the presenters. So Dan, do you want to come in with your points?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. So some of the data exists and isn't being shared, and some of it hasn't been gathered. And there are different costs associated with sharing and gathering data, but there are also different benefits. So my question is, to what extent do we think that the cost benefit analysis of collecting different grid data has actually been undertaken? Because I can imagine that, for example, data on keeping the lights on is something that politicians will have kind of required because there's an imperative there that doesn't actually necessarily even crunch into a cost benefit analysis, whereas data on curtailment will really help us understand the optimization of a grid, right? So sometimes the cost benefit analysis will be really important, other times there'll be other factors. But I just wonder whether anyone has any comments, because some countries have obviously properly invested, worked out benefits of doing this. We're going to collect the data, others have not. So, and it's not going to be the same for every country. I just wonder if anyone has any reflections on the level of maturity of undertaking cost benefit analysis for the collection of the range of data that we've been looking at for these studies.
I mean, from my perspective, I think when it comes to grid operations, I think they've probably got it. In terms of the grid development and policy side, and even the consumer services, I think there's less on those particular indicators in terms of an understanding of the cost benefit. But I think from a utility operational perspective, I think they probably understand the cost benefit of collecting data and the benefits to them. So yeah, Kieran?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So I think that the data will be there because they have to operate these systems, right? The challenges around, collecting it and storing it away in a way that it's useful. In my experience, governments, utilities are super keen to improve their data. So that's why I mentioned earlier, a key, like an obvious intervention for me as a development partner would be to go in there and sit down with the governments, with the system operators, with the utilities, and actually try to help them with that process. I don't think there's a huge cost involved. There obviously is a cost, but my experience, including working with Brian when we were at the IEA, is that countries are really keen to improve their data. So that's a kind of clear opportunity for me.
Hi, Brian. If I can just add, then I really like the idea of the cost benefit analysis, so we can say what are the informations, what are the data that are more important that will help the data driving analysis for this expansion, for this long term that the policy makers and investors need. And one thing that I have seen here in Brazil in particular is that sometimes the market will demand that. So in Brazil, for example, in the beginning of 2021, when we started to have the curtailment problems, the market started to demand from the operator what's the curtailment data from all, because I want to have this transparency that what's happening because it's affecting my generator and my investment. So I think that sometimes maybe we don't have this cost benefit analysis, but I think sometimes the market we also have to respond what are the data that are more important, that are affecting more the system. And I think this will help the utilities to prioritize what has to be publicly updated and shared than others won't.
Thank you, Amanda. We're coming towards the end of the time now. I noticed there was a couple of questions just came through on the chat. I think there was one from Eric was asking, is it possible to provide insights on data collection and utilization for a utility? I work in a utility. I'm interested in working on this for progressive data. So in terms of the experience of working with the utilities there, I think is the question.
Yeah, this was directed at me, but Eric,
yeah.
I think this is a good example of utilities being really interested in this, as I mentioned before. But I don't know if Brian has some insights, but Eric, unfortunately, you're asking the wrong person. But we can take this, we can certainly take this offline, and I can put you in touch with experts who would know a little bit better about this kind of stuff than I would. But I don't know, Brian, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just for me, one of the senses I'm getting from this webinar as a whole is that it would be, people are interested in seeing what are all of the data that could be collected. And I think that would help a ton in how the utilities could potentially collect more data, because we've shared the key indicators, but there's this broader set that I think would allow for the utilities to, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's about digitalization. One of the key points on my first slide, there needs to be a digitalization at the utilities to better understand, the flow of energy and expenses and costs and all of that. So digitalization will help with data collection for sure.
Right,
Julia
thank you
or
both.
Yeah.
Amanda, do you want to come in on that or?
No, absolutely.
Okay.
Really.
Yeah.
I'm agree with them.
Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you. Right. I think we are coming towards the end. I'm just checking to see there's a couple more questions or points coming in.
Yeah, interesting
question. Sorry, is that Brian or Kieran?
Yeah, I was just going to say the interesting comment that data collection has helped increase revenue generation in Nigeria by 90%. That's a really interesting comment.
Yeah, that sounds like a definite cost benefit from where I'm sitting. I mean, one of the things that I took away from hearing the presentations today and also seeing the data coming through is different countries are at different stages, and Brian, you said at the start that there wasn't much congestion shown on the on some of the grids in Africa, and they were they're at an earlier place in their evolution compared to maybe grids elsewhere. So there is, even if your grid doesn't look like somebody else's grid, it might look like it in the future. And what are the learnings there? And it is around understanding the impacts of the changes that are happening and being able to sort of get ahead of the curve. Because I know from experience in a developed country where we've had quite a rapid uptake of renewables, we've got into a position where we've got high levels of congestion and predicting to have continued congestion for some time because the grid is not being built fast enough, basically. If I went back 10 years and knew what I know now, the grid would look different. That's fact of life, and I think that kind of powerful learning could be easily translated to say, well, actually, we're not congested today, but I've just looked at that, the impact of solar in Brazil, and need to understand what's going to happen around. I need to think about in terms of flexibility and ramp rates. I should be preparing for that now. And understanding that. So I do think there's some really interesting read acrosses that countries can get from this. So I think I'm going to write us. We are on time. I'm going to say thank you very much to the presenters, to Dan, Kieran, Brian, Amanda, and Julia for stepping into the breach at the last minute. We'll be sharing the slides. I do wonder, I know we had a question about the what was all the data that was collected, whether we can share a long list as well. I'll check with the presenters afterwards to see if we can share that kind of information. Hopefully we should be able to as well. And please, if you want to follow up with any of this, and as in your region in particular, I think the individual presenters and organisations are happy for you to contact them and find out more. I don't know. Also, if you want to contact ourselves at Green Grids Initiative as well to follow up as well, we're happy to help facilitate that conversation. So thank you all. Apologies for some of the technical glitches we've had today. And if you liked it that much, we are on again later today. We are at 4 p.m. UK time, and we will be running through the same presentations. And so there's an opportunity if you had any problems connecting to listen again, and also we'll be sharing the recordings of the presentations as well. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day or rest of your evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.